the Bunche Center to say a few words, but we are delighted to have Moderator Julius Johnson. He's here, he's my friend, a great Pan-Africanist, and he's going to be the moderator for this conference. So we'll be starting now. Julius, so you'll be, you don't know, you're the one that's you're in charge.
Let us have a moment of silence for all those great Pan-Africanists that have been martyred over the years in the cause for Pan-Africanism. Thank you. To start this very important discussion, I want to ask the Deputy Director of the Ralph Bunche Center, Gnaka, to grace us with a few opening remarks. Thank you. Tania?
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Ralph Bunche Center. I did not prepare anything, but we're very happy that you all are here today, having this very important conversation. I see a lot of people that I know, friends, old and new, so welcome. The Bunche Center is here whenever you need it. Please know that. We're happy to support conversations like this with partners from the community. So welcome, make yourself at home, and here's to a productive meeting.
Thank you. Thank you, Tania. I am Julius Johnson. I wear two hats here at Howard University. I am the Deputy Director of the Charles B. Rangel International Affairs Program here at the Ralph Bunche Center. And I'm also a PhD candidate in the prestigious Department of African Studies. And I'm honored to be your moderator this afternoon. As we all know, Pan movements are extraordinarily relevant and very, very important in the struggle for liberation and independence, be it Pan-Africanism, Pan-Arabism. And today, we want to take a critical look at some of the implications and challenges of Pan-Africanism. As we all know, there historically have been some individuals who are real giants in the movement of Pan-Africanism. To name a few, Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who coined the phrase, Africa for Africans at home and abroad. Of course, C.L.R. James, George Padmore, the great late Kwame Nkrumah, who on the dawn of the independence of Ghana uttered the famous words, "Without the total liberation of Africa, our liberation is meaningless." Kwame Nkrumah understood the power and importance of Pan-Africanism. George Padmore, of course, worked with him, who was the director of the African Bureau in Ghana, as was many other individuals. This was an exciting time for Africa. It was a time of independent states. Big men and women taking ownership of state building and the direction of Africa. Well, that cry for Pan-Africanism has continued to today. And it's a welcome continuation. And so today, we want to do somewhat of a deep dive with our esteemed panelists to get into some of the nitty-gritty, if you will, of Pan-Africanism. Before I introduce our first panelist, Dr. Clark, who teaches here in the African Studies Department, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge some of the elders, one elder in particular in the room, true revolutionary fighter for justice and equality and liberation. He's a man that I've known since the late 1980s, and he is the head of the Constituency for Africa. Please, let's give a welcome round of applause for Mr. Melvin Foote. Thank you, Mel. I did not expect to see you for your tireless work, love of Africa, and I'm very glad you're here, as well as all the other elders. You know, in African tradition, you must always ask permission from the elders to begin. So for all those elders who are in the room, may we begin?
Yes. You may do so.
Thank you, sir. And with that, I'd like to ask Dr. Clark, who is our first speaker. She is a professor here in African Studies, to share a few words on the topic at hand, Pan-Africanism.
Thank you for that great introduction. So I've known Gnaka. Gnaka is one of the people that came to me to work on organizing this panel. I've known Gnaka for several years, over a decade at least. We were classmates here in African Studies at Howard, and I know how seriously and tirelessly he works in the name of Pan-Africanism. So he often teases me because my area of research is hip-hop. And so I work specifically on the use of hip-hop for social activism and social commentary on the continent of Africa. So when he suggested I speak, you know, he said, you can talk about your hip-hop. And so I said, okay, hip-hop and Pan-Africanism actually go together really well, so it really wasn't difficult to do. So I kind of want to, for those of us who may be less familiar with how well hip-hop and Pan-Africanism go together, I kind of want to get some preliminary stuff in terms of defining what I mean by hip-hop. So what I mean by hip-hop is beyond rap music. So many of us, when we think of hip-hop, we think of specific artists, we think of specific songs. Typically those songs are not really good representations of hip-hop. If you turn on the radio or watch videos, you know what I'm talking about. And it's not even just the 5 elements. So those of us who are familiar with hip-hop, we know that the main elements are the rapper, the DJ, the graffiti artist, the break dancer, and the 5th element of hip-hop is knowledge of self. But when I'm speaking of hip-hop, I'm speaking of the culture. And I'm speaking of individuals who are involved in hip-hop. That could be hip-hop fashion designers, hip-hop photographers, hip-hop documentarians and writers, educators, are all part of hip-hop culture. So to provide more context, I wanted to recite a historic quote by hip-hop journalist and activist Touré. He wrote this for the New York Times in 1999 when people were talking about this thing called hip-hop culture. Not just the music again, but the culture. So he says, quote, I live in a country no map maker will ever respect, a place with its own language, culture, history. It is much a nation as Italy or Zambia, a place my countrymen call the hip-hop nation. We are a nation with no precise date of origin, no physical land, no single chief. But if you live in a hip-hop nation, if you are not merely a fan of the music, but a daily imbiber of the culture, then you know the hip-hop nation exists in any place where the hip-hop music is being played or hip-hop attitude is being exuded. We are a nation with our own gods and devils, traditions and laws, end quote. So it may seem kind of like this grand idea of hip-hop culture, but to see the impact that hip-hop culture has had and see how it has kind of gone side by side with Pan-Africanism and swept across the continent, what that quote says is not too far from the reality that exists for many youth throughout urban Africa. So when we discuss the role of hip-hop and Pan-Africanism, I'm speaking of the culture, not simply the music. So hip-hop culture was birthed in resistance. It came out of the 1970s South Bronx, Black and Latino youth resisting poverty, resisting police brutality. It questions authority. Hip-hop culture, by its nature, questions authority. It's loud, it's confrontational. Its primary concern is with representations of the marginalization of the Black and brown and urban. And hip hop can be unapologetically aggressive, which is, these things often get it in trouble on the continent. Unlike some other genres, artists are expected to represent their experiences and their identities. For example, MCs are expected to write their own lyrics and tell their own realities. Fashion designers are expected to represent urban Black experiences, and educators are expected to push their students to question and reject representations of them by dominant power structures. So throughout this, I'm not a rapper, I am not artistically talented, but I wanted to highlight some songs. And the reason I chose these songs and the reason why I'm doing this is, again, many of us don't listen to some of these artists, don't know some of these artists, because they're not, you don't hear them on the radio, you're not going to hear them on MTV or see their videos on MTV, but they're out there and they're having an impact. So one of the artists is a guy named Crooked, who's out of Uganda. And so you're not going to see Crooked on MTV. You're not going to hear him on Hot 95. But every kid in Kampala knows who Crooked is and can recite these lyrics. And so the influence of what he's saying resonates with them. And I'm choosing these songs because they're decidedly Pan-African. So he had a song called African that came out, I don't want to give a precise year, about 5 years ago. And in it, this is just an excerpt. He says, I'm Ugandan, I'm Kenyan, I'm Tanzanian. I'm Zambian, I'm Gambian, I'm Ghanaian. I'm Algerian, Liberian, Nigerian. African American, American African, African American. I'm Angolan, I'm Mozambican. I'm gonna raise my voice so you know I'm speaking. It ain't by choice that I live and breathe it. I bleed it. I'm still here even when I leave it. I'm Haitian, I'm Jamaican. I carry my race like a conversation. And so this again is an example of hip hop artists expressing Pan-Africanism, expressing Pan-African identities through their lyrics, through their music. And other ways I'm gonna discuss in a minute. So hip-hop culture in Africa emerged and integrated itself with the various urban cultural environments that it found itself in. But from the very beginning, hip-hop culture in Africa was a Pan-African enterprise. There is no other way to define it or describe it. So yes, there have been people who said, oh, this is popular, let me imitate it, let me mimic it. But by and large part, when you look at, for example, in South Africa, hip-hop comes in during apartheid South Africa. And you have groups like Black Noise and Prophets of the City that are, according to the apartheid government, defined as colored. They use the lessons of activists like Steve Biko and hip-hop music through the words of people like Chuck D from Public Enemy to reject apartheid racial divisions and articulate a Black identity, rejecting a colored identity that was given to them. So hip-hop culture comes to South Africa, comes into the colored township of Mitchell's Plain in the Cape Flats area of Cape Town, and colored youth use it to begin to articulate Black and Pan-African identities. Again, these are musicians, but the same thing happened with the graffiti artists out of South Africa. The same thing happened with the b-boys. So it wasn't just hip-hop music that came, it was the graffiti that came, it was the breakdancing that came, it was the whole culture, the attitude, and the resistance, and the articulation, again, of global ghetto Black experiences, quote unquote. Artists all over the continent identified with hip-hop culture and adopted it to express their own reality. So it went beyond just imitating into recognizing a commonality with their brothers and sisters in the United States and saying, look, this is a culture we share, but we're going to use it to articulate what's going on in our neighborhoods, in our quote-unquote hoods. So they use it to represent their spaces in a global hip-hop community, to resist local power structures, and to find new ways to advance Pan-Africanism. All right, so there have been quite a few projects that have come up that I wanted to just mention. I'll mention one. One was the Presidents of Africa project in 2010, led by Senegal's DJ Awadi, who traveled to 13 countries and the diaspora to do an album and a film, documentary film, talking about Pan-Africanism and how it was up to our generation and younger to take on the mantle, take the torch that was left by people like Nkrumah, Nyerere, Mandela. And so that was in 2010, and I wanted to end with looking at hip hop and social activism. So I want to say that hip hop and Pan-Africanism go together. However, there is need for a greater Pan-African involvement in what's happening in some of these social movements. So 2011, many of us heard about Yanamar, the movement in Senegal, which was crucial in overthrowing the president. Hip hop culture was very influential. They went on to impact what happened in Burkina Faso in 2013 with an organization, I'm not speaking French, so I'm not going to try to say it. Yes, thank you. And then in 2015, those activists went to the Democratic Republic of the Congo with activists there who were trying to do something similar or got arrested and sent back to their countries. But again, this is groups coming to different parts of the continent. The diaspora needs to come into this. South Africa 2015 Fees Must Fall movement, very much influenced by hip hop. Hip hop artists were involved in that movement, and it was also very much influenced by what's happening here in terms of Black Lives Matter. More recently, what we need help with, or we need more involvement, 2015 in June, Angola, a lot of people don't know what's happening there.